Hello everyone. I know it's only been a couple days since my more recent video, but I figured as a little Christmas bonus, I would do a more off-the-cuff video. So recently I posted on Blue Sky about doing a Q&A video and asked if anyone had any questions for me. I did get a couple, but it seems people were more primarily interested in any tips I have regarding the hobby itself. So today, I have decided to do both a quick Q&A video as well as going over some of the stuff that I've learned over the years that might help someone new to the hobby. Starting things off, the first question asked was, when and how did you get started on retro modding? So I got my start with retro tech work around the same time as I started collecting, which was roughly around 2012-2013. Around that time, NES was not only the hot thing to collect for, but prices were already starting to rise, so I knew very early on that the best way to get into collecting was by taking in junked systems and games and fixing them up. Because back then, it wasn't uncommon to get defective systems for like $5 or less. Now, I have a lot of stories to tell about systems that I've personally worked on, but that's for another time. In terms of modding though, the first ever mods that I ever really got into were reproduction cartridges. I used to grab games for like $1 to $2 a pop, gut their ROMs, reprogram EPROMs with a cheap Willem EPROM programmer and an old laptop that still had a parallel port for me to use, slap them on and have a grand time. That was actually how I made money early on for collecting games, as unfortunately nobody wanted to give me a chance when I was applying for jobs in the area. The next two questions asked were, what was your first console and your favorite one? I decided to combine these two because the answer is the same for both. The first console I ever had was the Nintendo 64, and it continues to be my favorite system of all time. Now I know a lot of people, especially recently, seem to despise the N64 and what it stands for, but my earliest memory was a 3-year-old me sitting in front of a big boxy CRT playing Ocarina of Time. It was also a system that I spent a lot of time with family on, with games like Smash Bros, Mario Party 2, Mario Kart 64, Mortal Kombat 4, Pokemon Stadium, and so on and so forth. But yeah, in terms of unique questions, that's really it. Yeah, I know that was a very short Q&A, but I felt I still needed to at least answer these two questions that were given to me. Thank you to Juan Alvarez for the questions, by the way. But yeah, with that out of the way, time to get into some tips for beginner techs. Tip number 1. Understand your tools. It is very important to make sure that you have a full grasp on the tools you'll be working with. Now, I'm not saying that you need to fear your tools, but rather you need to have a firm understanding of what your tools are and how to use them effectively. This also includes any chemicals that you're going to be working with during this process. The less that you cut, burn, or poison yourself, the better. Also, please do not use a power drill for screwing and unscrewing systems. A powered screwdriver is fine, but not a drill. Those have way too much torque, and you run the risk of breaking a screw post or cracking the shell as a result. Tip number 2. Do not hyperheat. This is a common pitfall for a lot of beginners in the hobby when working with soldering equipment. The logic is, if they set their equipment to an excessively high temperature, it should make it easier to melt solder, which, even though it's true, the consequence of that is you are more likely to burn out any important ICs, delaminate the board, or even pop any passive components. A general rule of thumb I like to go by is 320 degrees Celsius is a good temperature for working with through-hole components. 300 degrees Celsius is great for surface mount or replacing batteries, and 280 degrees Celsius is mainly for working with flat flex cables. The only time I would ever go past 320 degrees Celsius is if I'm working on something with a really thick PCB or a really thick ground plane, like removing the RF module off an NES front loader or recapping an original Xbox or Neo Geo MVS boards. In those instances, I like to go up to 340 degrees Celsius because those boards soak up a ton of heat. Tip number 3. Practice, practice, practice. Before approaching any system work, you need to get some practice in with your tools. I would recommend getting your hands on junked electronics like DVD players or old radios. Get familiar with screw management, disassembly and reassembly, and using soldering and desoldering equipment. I can't tell you how many times I've had to fix people's first attempts at console work, or how many times I've seen people get overconfident because they thought it was easy to do because some guy on YouTube makes videos about it. Always practice with your tools and techniques on junk boards before tackling any mod or repair jobs.
Tip number 4, start small and work your way up. Don't immediately spring onto projects that seem rather large in scale from the jump. Start with something simple and build your experience over time. What I did was not something I would recommend for beginners at all. If anything, I would say get your start with battery changes on cartridges first. Tip number 5, clean your tools. When you are finished with soldering or in between using your solder equipment, be sure to clean and service your soldering equipment regularly. If you don't, you will find that they will break down faster and faster over time due to the constant rise and fall of temperatures and the metal of those tools degrading more and more from use, resulting in you needing to sink more money due to a very preventable mistake. Stay on top of maintenance no matter what. And last but most importantly, tip number 6, integrity and humility is king. Time and again, I have seen newcomers to the scene gain more and more confidence in their craft as they learn more about it, which is great on its own. However, I have also seen some of them start to get lazier with their work or act like because they have more experience, they know better than most. Console mods and repairs are a never-ending process that evolve more over time. Regarding the former, just because something works doesn't mean it is the correct way of doing it. For example, clipping surface mount capacitors might be easier, but can also do some serious damage if the pads underneath are compromised. There are those that will always try to take the easy way, but that should never stop you from doing things the right way. As for the latter, you need to be more open to new information and changes when someone provides solid reasoning behind needing to change the way you do things. Also, do not reject criticism. When someone is coming at you with criticism, understand where they are coming from and see how you can go about resolving the issue. If all you do is treat all criticism the same way one treats troll comments, less and less people will take you seriously, and less people would be open to helping you when you need it most. Be grateful for the opportunities given to you and take each project as a learning experience. Integrity and humility go a long way, not just in honing your craft, but building a community of like-minded individuals who will support you and your work. Now, as for tool recommendations, I don't recommend you go out and buy the latest Hako equipment if you're just starting out. Using cheaply manufactured tools is plenty serviceable, whether you do this as a hobbyist or as a profession. Now, I usually leave links to all my equipment in the description of my videos, but they're often buried in a tomb of credits, so I will leave links to the surface level of my description for this video. But I would say the first big thing you need is a soldering station. Having temperature controllable equipment is really important, as you can't apply the same temperature on all surfaces. The best bang for your buck would be the T12 soldering stations. I personally use the KSGER T12 soldering station that Voltar recommended in his videos. It is a really solid unit and has served me well for a few years now. From there, you'll also need some desoldering braid, a desoldering pump, soldering iron holder, solder, and flux. I usually buy the braid and pump through this really nice 7-piece pack off Amazon, and it is really good value for what you get. As for a soldering iron holder, well, I will be linking to one that I find to be really useful, but personally I use one that I've had since I was a young pup with a Radio Shack soldering station. It also comes with a holder for a sponge and copper wool for cleaning the tip of your iron, which, when using the sponge, make sure you use distilled water on it. Do not use tap water. Now, as far as solder and flux, I always recommend using trusted brands for both. Do not cheap out on your solder or flux, as your work can be greatly affected by how cheap your burnable materials are. For solder, I recommend KSGER branded solder with either 6040 rosin core or SN63 PB37. In both instances, it needs to be leaded solder, as it is way more durable than most lead-free solder, and most retro systems use leaded solder anyways. For flux, I like to use two different types. No Clean Liquid Flux from MG Chemicals, which I will also include a link to some syringe bottles that I use with it. This stuff is what I mainly use for soldering on flex cables, as it doesn't leave any tacky residue behind. However, it does evaporate really fast. For most other uses, I personally use No Clean Paste Flux from ChipQuik. Whether it's SMD or through-hole work, this stuff works like magic when you need the flux to stick around a little longer. Now, obviously you will still need some cleaning materials for the board as well. I would recommend getting 91 to 99% isopropyl alcohol for any PCB related cleaning, as well as cotton swabs, toothbrushes, nylon brushes, and small paint brushes. Toothbrushes work for a general use case, while small paint brushes work to get into the cracks and crevices that the toothbrush can't reach. The nylon brush is great for something that needs a little bit more abrasive scrubbing. With that, you basically have everything you need to get started. Once you get used to the basics of soldering, you can then graduate into using desoldering tools like a Hot Air Rework Station and a desoldering gun. I personally use the 858D for hot air work, but I'm told some 858D stations aren't wired correctly, so always check reviews to be sure that the unit you're buying is good to go. As for desoldering guns, I use ones attached to a dedicated station. My current model is a ZD915. However, it has been rather difficult to source parts for it lately, so I can't recommend it for the long term. However, I was recently gifted a Yihua 948 station when my ZD915 eventually bites the dust, and it seems parts for that unit are more readily available. The desoldering gun is going to be the most expensive piece of equipment you're going to buy, but well worth the investment when you get into through-hole components. That cheap pump can also do the job, but it will only get you so far before you hit a wall. When doing things like through-hole recapping or any sRGB work, you need a proper desoldering gun station. And that's really it. I hope all this helps you out on your modding journey, and I wish you the best of luck. With that out of the way, Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays to you all. And as always, until the blue moon rises, I'll see you next time.